In this video, we begin our discussion on Chapter 5, Part 2, where looking ahead, currently we are going through consumer choice to develop a framework to explain the decision-making process of consumers, as this will yield a richer explanation for product demand, as well as allow us to examine how responsive consumers are to change. Where, in regards to the second half of Chapter 5, this is going to be devoted to developing product demand by considering utility maximization as well as product demand itself. Where, in regards to today's discussion on utility maximization, we will set up some preliminaries to then have our discussion on utility maximization. So beginning with our preliminaries, with respect to consumers, we know that they have wants in the form of leisure time as well as consuming goods and services, whereas their resources will be in the form of income as well as time. They will then make choices with their time and income to make themselves the best off possible in terms of leisure time and the goods and services they consume, where right now we are solely concerned with the resource of income and the want of consuming goods and services. Additionally, from our first third of consumer choice, we know that consumers will rank their choices based off of their preferences, which we can measure through utility and examine graphically via indifference curves. Secondly, we know that consumers will have choices available to them based off of their income and the prices they face on goods and services, which we can examine graphically via the budget constraint. Now we seek to use this information to develop a decision-making rule for the consumer, as this will allow us to explain why a consumer purchases the combinations of goods and services they did. And to proceed, we will continue our discussion with our consumer going to the grocery store with some income for a post-workout meal. So we have our consumer with some amount of income. They go to the grocery store and then they end up leaving with a combination of ground beef and brown rice. The question we have then is, how did they arrive at that selection of ground beef and brown rice quantities? Well, we know a couple of things. Their possible choices are going to be based off of their budget constraint, and we know that the budget constraint has a rate of change in the form of the price ratio, that is, the price of a good in terms of another good. We also know that consumers rank their choices based off of preferences, which we can examine via indifference curves, which has a rate of change in the form of the marginal rate of substitution. That is, the rate at which a consumer will exchange X for Y and have the same level of utility. Lastly, we know that consumers want to make themselves the best off possible. That is, maximize utility. Therefore, they will compare the two rates of change, that is the marginal rate of substitution, to that of the price ratio. So then, let us use this information to work through a decision rule then. We have our utility maximization process on the right, where we have quantity of brown rice on the vertical axis and quantity of ground beef on the horizontal axis. We have an initial indifference curve for a particular level of utility in purple, labeled as indifference curve 0, and we also have our budget constraint representing all the possible choices available to our consumer with their current income and the prices they are facing. Since they want to make themselves the best off possible, we know that they're going to compare the marginal rate of substitution to that of the price ratio, and since they're exhausting all of their income, we also know then that our choice is going to be somewhere on our budget constraint. So then this eases up our analysis in that we need to compare our intersections between the indifference curves and our budget constraint. So currently we have 2, so let us begin with that. Suppose consumer considers point A at this combination of brown rice and ground beef. Is the consumer the best off possible? The answer is going to be no, in that there's incentive to consume additional quantities of ground beef and less quantities of brown rice, and this is going to be due to the marginal rate of substitution being greater than the price ratio, or in other words, the rate at which this consumer will give up brown rice for further quantities of ground beef is greater than what the market is asking for, or in other words, additional utility provided by ground beef is greater than that of its cost. Therefore, the consumer has incentive to consume more ground beef, and since income is finite and they're using all of their income, that means giving up some brown rice. So then this is generating that rightward movement along our budget constraint. So then, if point A doesn't make the consumer the best off possible, what about our other intersection point, which we'll call point C? Is the consumer the best off possible? Well, the answer is going to be no, given that in this case, the consumer has incentive to consume more brown rice and less ground beef. And this is going to be due to the marginal rate of substitution being less than that of the price ratio, or in other words, the rate at which this consumer will give up brown rice for further quantities of ground beef is less than what the market is asking for, or in other words as well, additional utility provided by ground beef is less than that of its cost. Therefore, the consumer has incentive to reduce consumption of ground beef, and since income is finite and they're using all of their income, less ground beef means more brown rice, and this is going to be generating that leftward movement along our budget constraint. So then, if point A and point C are two intersection points didn't make the consumer the best off possible, what about a higher indifference curve for a higher level of utility? Let us examine this and consider indifference curve 1, which we see is strictly above indifference curve 0, so this is going to be a higher level of utility in which the consumer is better off. And once again, we have two intersection points between our indifference curve 1 and our budget constraint. Let us consider the upper intersection point first, which we'll consider as point D. Does point D make the consumer the best off possible in terms of its quantity of brown rice and ground beef? Well, the answer is going to be similar to that of point A in that no. In this case, the consumer has incentive to consume further quantities of ground beef and less quantities of brown rice due to the marginal rate of substitution being greater than the price ratio, where in this instance, additional utility provided by ground beef is greater than its cost. Therefore, the consumer has incentive to consume more ground beef. Since income is finite, consuming more ground beef means less brown rice since they're using all of their income. So this is generating that rightward movement along our budget constraint. Okay, so if point D doesn't work, what about our second intersection point with indifference curve 1 and our budget constraint? We'll call this point E, and similar to what we saw with point C, the answer is going to be no, in that our consumer is not the best off possible. And this is going to be that there is incentive for the consumer to consume further quantities of brown rice and fewer quantity of ground beef. And this is going to be due to the marginal rate of substitution being less than the price ratio, or that additional utility provided by ground beef is less than its price. Therefore, the consumer has incentive to consume further quantities of brown rice. Since income is finite and they're using all of their income, additional quantities of brown rice mean fewer quantities of ground beef. So this is going to generate that leftward movement along our budget constraint. So the consumer is going to go through this process in n amount of times, considering different levels of utility, until they reach a particular level of utility that we see is going to occur with indifference curve 2. So then this poses the question of, is the consumer the best off possible at point B at the utility level that indifference curve 2 provides and its intersection with the budget constraint, where we see here the budget constraint only intersects this indifference curve once? The answer is going to be yes, the consumer is the best off possible in that they can consume more of either good and be better off. In that when we look at point B, if the consumer tried to consume further quantities of ground beef and less quantities of brown rice, this would make them worse off, and this would put them on a lower indifference curve, which means lower utility. Therefore, they do not have incentive to consume more ground beef. And if they try to consume further quantities of brown rice and less quantities of ground beef, we have the same story, in that this would put them on a lower indifference curve, which means lower utility, and that means making them worse off. So, with no incentive to deviate, the consumer is the best off possible, and this is going to occur when the marginal rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio, or in other words, the rate at which this consumer will exchange brown rice for further quantities of ground beef is equal to what the market is asking for, or in other words, additional utility provided for ground beef is equal to its cost, and additional utility provided for brown rice is equal to its cost. So then the last thing we want to consider, just to be sure, is what happens if the consumer tried to consider a higher level of utility than point B, say with some point on indifference curve 3, which is strictly above indifference curve 2. Well, here what we immediately see is that these choices are not affordable to the consumer in that they are strictly above our budget constraint. So then this leaves us assured that point B, the indifference curve that intersects our budget constraint solely once, is the point at which the consumer is the best off possible and occurs when the margin rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio. So then graphically what we saw then is the consumer's decision of ground beef and brown rice is based upon being on the highest indifference curve possible that is compatible with their budget constraint. This occurs when the margin rate of substitution is equal to the price ratio, in that there's no further incentive to consume more or less of either good. So then in terms of going back to our original question, our consumer makes their selection upon comparing additional satisfaction to additional cost, where their selection occurs when additional satisfaction is equal to additional cost for each good. And where we'll pick up in our next video is use this information to then develop product demand.